Hello and welcome to the Las Vegas Book Festival 2020. I'm Steve Sebelius, the politics and government editor for the Las Vegas Review-Journal. I'm very pleased in this panel to welcome John Dickerson, who is a correspondent for 60 Minutes and who wrote this book, The Hardest Job in the World, The American Presidency. By way of introduction, John is also a former co-host of CBS This Morning. He has written for The Atlantic, Time, and Slate, co-hosts the Slate political podcast, political Gabfest podcast, pardon me, and hosts the Whistle Stop podcast, which sprang from his last book, Whistle Stop, his favorite stories from presidential campaigns. John, thanks for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for having me.
So this book is, it's a book festival, so we'll start with a couple process questions. This book is based on an article you wrote for The Atlantic in 2018. But you indicated in the acknowledgments that your interest in this subject goes back a little bit further than 2018, maybe even as far as 30 years. So at what point did you know that you had a book with all this material?
Well, that's right. It goes back 30 years because it basically encompasses all of the things I've learned or thought about during the course of my career covering politics, which goes back about that far. There are various points along the way. In 2004, I was at President Bush's ranch in Crawford, Texas, talking to him after having interviewed him for Time magazine. And he said, he was running against John Kerry at the time. And he said, if you want to know whether a person is able to do the job of being president, ask them how they make decisions. Because he said making decisions is the centerpiece of the job. And that was one of those turning point moments. There have been many of them over the years in which I started to think about the job as it actually is, what a president really has to do. And then looking at what they do, test whether we ask those kinds of questions during a presidential campaign. And the answer to that question has been no, pretty much for my entire career, which is to say that we don't pay very much attention to the attributes and requirements for the job of being president when we elect people to be president. And as a result, we find some disconnects and some mismatches. And we have a situation where the standards for the office are kind of constantly shifting, whereas the duties of the office are relatively fixed. Certainly in the most important realms of the office. So it was that disconnect between the way we talk about the job in campaigns and the job as it actually is that was the germ for the book and all of my reporting.
So interesting in the sense of with that revelation, did you look back then on all the material that you had collected over the course of your career in a wholly different way?
I did. And in fact, in part of the book, I used my own reporting and my own view of things as it evolved as a way to what I hoped was reset expectations for readers and viewers and participants in American government. The overemphasis on speech making, for example, the way my view evolved on the idea of presidential responsibility and why it's important and how we should measure it. Thinking about presidential lying and what role that plays in the job. So certainly I went back and looked at my own thinking and also, spent a little bit more time really poking at some of the things I learned to believe along the way to either believe in them more deeply after further examination or to believe in them provisionally with some caveats or to discard them altogether.
Your last book, as I mentioned, Whistle Stop, was focused a lot on campaigning for the job and the different aspects and stories about campaigning. This book focuses on the job itself, and we'll get into this later. But they're two very different books, and they're two very different things: the campaigning and the governing.
They are, although in this book, I was helped by, the Whistle Stop podcast, which started out as just being about campaigns, then sort of morphed once the 2016 campaign was over into being a podcast about sort of key presidential moments. And that was part of where I did some of the initial run-up work to this book, I also wrote that cover story for The Atlantic about some of these themes. And it allowed me to use specific instances in presidential history to test some of these ideas, to use them as a way to illustrate these ideas. And the campaigns that I write about in the Whistle Stop book are fun, illuminating. They give you a sense of how politics has changed, and that's important because campaigns often set the preconditions for the way we look at the presidency, and also they're the testing ground of the candidates themselves, who then have to go engage in the presidency. In the most recent book, I spend that middle section trying to make the case for how the way we run campaigns, mostly in the post-Kennedy era, though some people would go all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt, that we have come to run campaigns in a way that drives us further and further from a process that measures for the attributes for the job, largely because we've become more fixated on the immediate response, as will be the case in the third and final debate, the immediate response to events, rather than having a kind of longer term view.
Yeah, and this book I would highly recommend to any person who covers politics, especially reporters who cover people running for executive offices, whether it be mayor, governor, president. There are some insights in here that I found very useful, and like you, I thought I had a handle on covering politics. I've been doing it for quite some time. And at various points during this book, I thought to myself, my God, I've been doing it wrong the whole time. So it was definitely insightful there. And we'll get to some advice maybe for journalists toward the end. But it seems to me you don't make things easy on yourself in this book. It's not just a book about the presidency, although it is about the presidency. It's not just a book with advice to journalists who are covering the presidency. It's a book that encourages a wholesale revision of how voters think about the presidency and how they go about picking people for the presidency. And it seems to me it requires what people in corporate culture talk about, a culture change, which is the most difficult thing to achieve in any organization, much less the body politic of 330 million Americans to say, hey, you guys also may have been doing it wrong this whole time. That's pretty tall order.
It is a tall order. It's a tall order to, on the one hand, putting it out in the course of an election is the perfect time to do it, because we're in the course of a selection process that I argue is not as good as it could be. But one of the reasons it's not as good as it could be is that the momentary distractions of a campaign are just too hard for people to resist. They're entertaining, they're maddening, and they appeal to our emotional reactions, which are the ones we have most ready at hand. But what's been the case with American politics always is the emotional reactions to issues that are ready at hand are only a portion of what is a part of government and is a part of making decisions that will improve the country as a whole. To get at the really complicated questions of American democracy, you have to kind of put your emotions aside for a moment, or think more long term and not be distracted by the short term as much. Well, it's a very hard thing to do, to make that argument in the course of the constant, steady diet of news cycle freneticism that's a part of our modern campaign, and that's been accelerated even further by Donald Trump, who is a real accelerant on a lot of the conditions that I write about in the book.
That is for sure, and we'll talk about social media in a second and how that contributes to that. What would you say for voters if they can for a moment put aside the day-to-day constant fire hose of news and reporting on the presidency, are the most important aspects that they should look for in a presidential candidate? It's really not what we think. It's not the ability to be glib or to go on Arsenio Hall and be able to play a saxophone with some alacrity. It's something. It's things that we don't normally think about.
Well, one of the best examples of that point, it was when I was doing interviews with people who served in the West Wing, people who had been CEOs of companies, philanthropists, military leaders. And I would start with all of them by asking, if you were doing a job interview for the presidency, what would be the first question you would ask people? And they all, not they all, but the vast majority of them said, well, I'd want to know how they hire people. I'd want to know how they build a team. And this connected with something that I'd come across in my other work, which was basically, and President Obama said this when I interviewed him. And in fact, he's been saying it on the stump. He was saying it on the stump in Pennsylvania yesterday when making the case for Joe Biden. He wasn't saying Joe Biden is so great and he's, ice cream for everyone and sunshine all day long. He was saying that he said Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will know how to put together a team to attack all of these problems that America faces. And we should think of the presidency as an organization, not as a single person's operation. And that's not so much the way we talk about it in presidential campaigns. I mean, how many questions have there been at debates about a candidate's team building talent or team building process? Even if you don't forget for a moment whether they're any good at it, do they even have an idea about how to build a team? And what does it mean to have an idea about how to build a team? When Michael Bloomberg was in his first term as mayor, or I should say, reflecting back on his first term as mayor, he said, during my first 100 days, or at the end of my first 100 days, the press would ask me, what did you do? And he said, I built a team. And he said, the press never understood what I was talking about. But his point was that unless you build a team right away and get some operating rhythm for that team, you're not going to be able to handle the job, both in its basic aspects and also when a crisis hits. And we've certainly seen that with President Trump. And the other presidents have had similar issues, but President Trump has had both crises that have hit in a surprise nature, and also he's seen vast and significant turnover in the top spots sort of constantly in his presidency, which makes it very hard to develop a working relationship, which, as I said, in all of these interviews, people were saying that's the crucial part of the job.
Yeah, and certainly Donald Trump has changed many things about the nature of how we think about the presidency. But even before Donald Trump, Democrats had been accused of not really building the base in terms of, candidates for in the House and Senate, the potential presidents, because the criticism was they'd been exclusively focused on the presidency. Getting somebody into the presidency was the end goal, and it really, the focus was on a single person rather than, as you're saying, on the individuals and the team that they bring to bear, without whom they really can't execute a presidential agenda. I mean, it's just not one person behind the magic curtain pulling the gears and levers.
Right. Yes, exactly. I mean, a lot of major decisions get made that the president really has no role in. Or when a president does make a decision, he makes it based on a series of options that are presented to him by the people he's hired, and they shape those options. And so a president may think he or she is making a decision when presented options A, B, and C, but what they're not being presented is options D, E, and F, all of which may have been better than A, B, and C, but which the president has no understanding of or knowledge that they even exist, because a president has such a little amount of time, is pulled in so many different directions, they can only know so much on every issue. And the more they study it, the more they're not tending to the other parts of the job. So you really see in understanding a presidential organizational structure how reliant a president is on the team he puts around him.
Yeah, and we I think even in popular culture, when the concept for the West Wing was originally drafted, it was supposed to be about the presidential staff. The president was going to be a little scene figure who appeared on camera occasionally, and the next thing you know, Martin Sheen's front and center in every episode, dispensing wisdom and playing chess and doing all of the other things that we saw him do, and was essential to the plot. To where now you have people waxing philosophic on Twitter. Boy, I wish we had a Josiah Bartlett in this race. It would make things so much easier. But he really, I mean, to use that example, he really exemplifies all the things that you say in the book should be presidential qualifications: reason, experience, temperament, restraint, having faced tough challenges and learning from them, the ability to build that team, and to the last one, concentrating relentlessly on two or three goals, I think didn't really apply, but he really exemplified those things. I don't know that we have a lot of candidates that really fit that bill.
No, and I lay out, I think in the end I came up with 18 attributes, which is more than any human can encompass. But I was trying to lay out the different attributes, but then also head off a trap that partisans in particular push, which is on any of the individual attributes. Let's say honesty. They treat it as if it's a binary thing. So you either lie or you tell the truth. And so they use that to either promote or knock down a candidate. And the fact is that every president lies. The question is, do they lie a little bit and for the right reasons, or do they lie all the time and for the absolutely wrong reasons? And that's true of any presidential attribute, whether if a president has a political instinct. Well, there's nothing wrong with having a political instinct, which is to say, understanding how politics works and the raw accumulation of power that is necessary. It's a precondition for being able to be president and also to get things done. So you wouldn't want a president who had no political skills. Sometimes in politics, presidents who have, Donald Trump will say, well, I'm not a politician. Well, actually, in a lot of senses, he's the ultimate politician who understands how to use power and gain power. So you want to find a medium, a happy medium between being a political novice and not knowing anything, and then somebody who's excessively political and only cares about their position in the political rank. The funny thing about the West Wing and the need for a central character is that that mirrors our public need with the presidency. And the reason we've come to overemphasize the presidential role in American politics is we, being the press, the voters, everybody else, kind of needs a central character. And that need for a central character has kind of warped the way our American system works. It has taken a lot of power away from Congress. It has caused us to rely on the president for solutions that should be local, or where a president doesn't particularly have expertise. Congress does. But, like Aaron Sorkin, we all need a central character. And that's one of the things we have to kind of resist when we seek to lump every national question in the president's lap.
Yeah, and if for no other reason, then it just doesn't work that way. We saw during the Obama administration, there was a reluctance of Congress to cooperate with the president and an over-reliance on executive orders, which are easily overridden by the subsequent president. And so the other branches are sort of shunted aside or take on an outsized influence. The attention paid to the Supreme Court nomination now is because that has become so critical in light of this, strong executive doing executive orders. That's one way we make progress. The court ruling either on those orders or on the laws that Congress occasionally gets around to passing, being the other, whereas Congress is sort of left out in the cold when they were always intended to be the engine that drove policy.
That's right. And the problem with Congress weakening is that it means both the president has too much on the president's plate and the president lacks a real willing partner to create durable solutions. As you said, executive orders don't work because then the next person just undoes them. And in part, this is a little bit of a weakness in the American system because the more laws Congress passes, essentially every time Congress passes a law, they give away a little bit of power to the executive branch because the executive branch has to execute those laws. And a lot of the power and control that the executive branch has taken into itself, it's taken through the administration of those laws and the choices about how to administer them. So every time a law gets passed, Congress is handing power over to the presidency, particularly if Congress can't move and act quickly to amend those laws or limit the president's action. In the old days, when Congress was very energetic, they could and was very jealous of protecting and maintaining their prerogatives. They could do it, but not in the Congress we're in now. So there's both willful handing over of power. There is just the kind of handing over of power that comes from being unable to assert itself. And then there's the power the president just grabs for himself. Then Congress doesn't fight him back.
Yeah. Like all executives, they're happiest when Congress is in recess. Let's talk about the obverse of the coin. If reason and restraint and temperament and the ability to build a good team are qualities that we want in a president, what are qualities that we don't want? What are things that would or should be disqualifying in a presidential candidate? If we saw them, we should go on red alert and say, hold on a second, this is not the guy for the job or the gal for the job.
Well, in keeping with my theory that it should be about positioning on a continuum, I think that what I would say is, I don't know that there are any absolute red flags, but if they have very low marks in a couple of key categories, I think you're in real danger. I think being tested is one place. If they have never been in a tough spot, personally or publicly, where they have had to endure some extended period of time facing real durable pressure, and I think that's dangerous. Again, on each of these, it doesn't mean that if they don't really have an experience of having been tested, that they are disqualified for the job. But it means they really have to overcompensate with other attributes. And so here's an example perhaps of that. So when it comes to the idea of building teams or managing people, and by managing, I don't mean looking over their shoulder and micromanaging them. I mean bringing in people who are very talented and then letting them do their thing. I mean, that's a kind of management. Delegation is a management technique. And Abraham Lincoln was very skilled at this. Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, The Team of Rivals, is quoted by not just presidential historians, but also CEOs and other people involved in leadership. Because of it's getting back to this team concept. Abraham Lincoln had no experience in building teams, really. Certainly not of that kind. And yet he was smart enough to build a team that would be able to work together, help protect him from his blind spots, and that nevertheless had this political composition and characterological composition that could have caused him a lot of problems. But he had a bigger goal in mind than having a team that was going to be subservient and placid. That was incredibly foresighted of him. So he hadn't built teams before, but he basically hit a home run on his first at bat. So that's why you never want to kind of throw out someone if they don't have any experience or any experience with one of the attributes that are important in the job. Washington experience would be another thing. It's not crucial that a presidential candidate have Washington experience, but it would be extremely helpful because the job requires getting along within the American system. And so if you have no experience with the American system, or if you want to burn down the American system, it's going to be very hard to get things done that are going to be durable and maximally effective for the entire country. I mean, you can go into the job and do things just for your political base, but that builds success on a rickety structure, and also, by the way, creates a lot of unrest in the land. So it's not the best way to go. So if you don't have Washington experience, well, you can leaven it with other kinds of skills. But I think you're in trouble if you've got somebody who has low marks on, a couple of these categories. The final one I would put in place is some durable sense of institutional fortitude, whether it's and nobody ever expected purely virtuous men to become president. In fact, it was impossible because the ambition that's required for the job struggles with that virtue, personal ambition against public virtue. But they've got to have some share of it, some amount of it, because at the last analysis, a president acts alone, and sometimes on decisions that have extremely high stakes. And when the president is alone facing those tough decisions, they have to have something inside them against which they can make that decision. Some sense of America's core values, its interests, have some vision, and not just be making it kind of on the fly. And that's a tough thing to test for, but it's an important thing to have in the job.
Yeah, unlike a COVID test, there really is no test for empathy or compassion or caring for other people before oneself in the country.
Yeah.
We can't really measure for that. I guess we have to go based on the candidate's record and all of that. But you did say something that I wanted to focus on, because you point this out in the book. Only in politics is experience considered a bad thing. And you say, a CEO may not be the best choice for a president, even though the jobs are somewhat comparable in certain respects, only because the job of president is wholly unlike a CEO in terms of the execution of your vision. You can come in as a CEO and you can fire people, you can shake things up, you can reorganize the organization. You can't do that in American government. You're sort of stuck with the machinery as it is, and the ability to work within that system is critical. But yet we tend to, we see business executives run and say, I'm not a politician, I'm going to come out there and run the government like a business. To me, that's always been a curious thing to say, because it's really not a business.
Well, you're exactly right. And the best quote about this introduces some of the complexity of this question. Is Hoover said, when you're sick, you want an uncommon doctor. When you're fighting in court, you want an uncommon lawyer. But when it comes to politics or being in government, the American people are willing to hire somebody with no experience at all. So in other words, not an uncommon Washington figure, and kind of just the opposite. Now, the funny thing about that is Hoover, of course, got very bad marks for his presidency, and he was in a way an uncommon Washington operator. I mean, he had such a powerful role at the Department of Commerce that he was called the deputy secretary of every other cabinet agency, because he was so influential and effective, and he'd been effective delivering aid to Europe after World War I. So if you were designing somebody who could come into the job and make the place work, it would have been Hoover. And so previous experience is not a guarantee of success, but it is in some ways a precondition. And to your other point, being a CEO is not a proxy for the presidency. It can hone a set of skills that, if you are the right kind of CEO or the right kind of entrepreneur, can be quite effective and quite useful in Washington. But it requires, in the same way that Eisenhower knew that his skills as a general were only going to be so effective in government, and that leadership in one institution needs to be retrofitted for and adapted to a new institution. That was one of Eisenhower's skills, was knowing that his skills in one job would not just immediately transfer over into the other, and that he would have to adapt. That was also true of Robert Rubin when he came in as Treasury Secretary, recognizing that being chairman of Goldman Sachs was helpful, but that he would really have to be on his toes about the new sets of skills that he would need. Well, if a president's been a CEO and recognizes that second important piece of it, that they can be as blinded by their previous experience as they can be helped by it, then they're in fine shape. But as I say in the book, and the various CEOs that I interviewed who then went into politics or went into government, there's a kind of blindness that comes with success. That experience makes people, particularly of a certain age, blind to the adaptation that's necessary and required to be successful, because they think, look, I'm successful. I've done this in this job. I can figure, I'll handle this new thing. But as you pointed out, the new thing has a series of challenges and none of the levers that you have in private enterprise.
Yeah. Do you think we've been talking about a lot of the things that the voters should, but maybe don't necessarily evaluate when picking a presidential candidate? Most of them, I think of Scott Adams' book, Winning Bigly, where he says that most of us think we make decisions in a rational way, but really we're making decisions on an emotional basis and then rationalizing those decisions intellectually to convince ourselves we made them rationally. Voters are deciding on a whole different set of metrics. So, do they get the president that they deserve? Do we get the president that we deserve?
Probably. I mean, Chris Christie kept saying that when I interviewed him, which is, I mean, one of the ways. So I'm arguing for changing the standard and the expectations for the job so that it more aligns with what the job actually is. What the idea of getting the president you deserve encompasses is changing the expectations and the standards of the job by basically lowering them. I had a colleague at Time Magazine who used to say when we were on deadline and the story wasn't coming together, would say, look, the best way to get to the deadline here is just to lower our standards. And in a sense, one professor who was made fun of my effort to try to improve the situation said, trying to get Americans to treat the job of the presidency in elections more seriously and to keep in mind what the job actually is, instead of the way we talk about it in the job in campaigns, is like trying to get teenagers to stop using emojis, which is maybe a very realist view of the way things are. It's pretty cynical. And so I think that there's no end to cynicism. Once you accept that view, then you basically can just go all the way right down to the bottom. Traditionally, in American government, we've had high ideals for individual participants and for the functioning of the institutions. And while they've been flawed and creaky and full of mistakes, it's usually aiming for a higher bar that tries to get us there. So there's no question that we get the presidents we deserve based on the way we pick them. So maybe if we change the way we pick them, we might get more deserving presidents. I just don't think there's an alternative. I just don't think we can. I mean, what I'm proposing is something quite complicated and unpleasant, because it's much more fun to kind of root for your team when you elect a president. But it's leading towards some pretty dangerous outcomes.
And I wonder if, our present circumstance might be a motivator for people to go your route as opposed to the route that we're going now, that's tribalist, rooting for the home team, instead of evaluating, characteristics that might make someone more effective and successful in the presidency, regardless of the party. I mean, the dysfunction that we see now, it can't satisfy anybody really, except for the extreme partisans on both sides who relish combat and nothing else. If you really want to get things done, if you really want to solve problems, if you really have a problem that has gone unsolved, it seems to me you would want a more effective system, not just with the president, not just with the people he picks, but also the Congress.
It does, but the American people, the American people are one group of people. Then there's the voters. Then there's the political obsessives, and even those are cut into finer groupings. And in those different categories, you have a different way of answering your question. So the true super partisans, and particularly in the Trump era on the Republican side, think anything he's doing is just wonderful. So they're fine with the way things are going. And in fact, and then you have a group that are super partisans who have policy goals that are not purely just affection for Donald Trump. And those partisans couldn't be happier. I mean, he has increased defense spending, filled the courts with judges who will be there for a generation. He has cut taxes, cut regulation. He has angered the liberals, and he's protected anti-abortion and continued anti-abortion measurements. So on a whole host of things, he's been great for a certain kind of Republican policy person who doesn't count as very large the downsides of his administration, which is the way in which he's done these things has created disunity in the country. He's blown the deficit wide open. He's gone back against the party's previous views on trade, to some extent immigration, but that those are all perfectly reasonable costs to incur. Then you have the group that was that basically believed those costs weren't high enough given all that he was doing, but then ultimately the costs got too large. And some of those people started trickling away in 2016 and then, have kind of grown since then. But for those first three categories of supporters, they basically collectively kind of are arguing, given the situation in politics right now, I'd rather have a bunch of wins for our team, because a politics in which everybody works towards compromise and is not possible. So let's just get as much victory as we can for our team under the current conditions, and the costs of doing so won't outweigh the benefits of getting what we wanted for our side.
Yeah, but does that game then always end in stalemate? If cooperation really isn't possible, then no matter who we elect as president, we're always going to end up in a draw. And so, one side gets a little bit of what they want, and it goes this way. Then the other side inevitably takes over as a reaction to the gains of the other side, and then they move the ball a little bit toward their side of the field. But it's always between those 40-yard lines. It never approaches the end zone, and we just go on fighting eternally between those 2 points.
Yes, I think, and I like the idea of fighting between the 40-yard lines and not getting to the end zone, or it's, fishtailing back and forth on the dead end road. Because I think if you could, to continue the football analogy, at some point the game runs out, the clock runs out and nobody's scored. And I think the darkest case is that this process of politics, not only do you have this trading of victories for each side, which ultimately becomes basically undoing what the previous side did, but that ultimately that this falls apart completely, that this is not a sustainable, you can't have 2 40-yard line, skirmishing between the 40-yard lines ultimately can lead to an irrevocably bad outcome. And I think that's, and what does that mean? That means basically each side maximizes its advantages. They never take care of the deficit. And then ultimately that becomes so large someday that it's impossible to take hold of or remedy. And the basis and basic part of the American economy crumbles. Or the number of Americans who are shut out of the American dream and the opportunity for accessing it becomes so large that their radicalism takes its place, takes to the streets or in violence, or that basically dreams and issues that are left unaddressed, dreams unfulfilled and issues unaddressed over long periods of time end up being the fuel for political revolution. And I don't know what form that takes, but that this going back and forth between the 40-yard line has a long-term danger is the real that's the real fear at the back of what we're going through now.
And I wonder, I don't think we've quite hit bottom just yet, because I was on a seminar put on by the UNLV William S. Boyd School of Law the other day with Russ Feingold, who was talking about a constitutional amendment so that even if the Republicans lost both the Senate and the presidency in 2020, that they would take on amending the Constitution and having Republican-dominated legislatures approve constitutional amendments that would cement some gains. So it seems to me that these rather elaborate and increasingly difficult scenarios are unnecessary if one would just look at, as you say, the Constitution, which has at its heart this idea of deal making. That the entire subtext, as Bill Clinton said, and you quoted him in the book, of the Constitution is let's make a deal. And the Constitution itself was the product of a great compromise that did not appeal to all sides, and that all sides were certainly not sanguine about, but agreed to for the greater good. And that example provides a way forward that would not result in radically reshaping the governing documents, or as you mentioned, a revolution that's the inevitable result of people frustrated by the fact that the system doesn't work and hasn't worked in many years.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So now the question is how to find these instances in which people will step away from the political process as it exists now, where all of the incentives are to continue, even if Donald Trump loses. Will it be sufficient to change his party? Or if Joe Biden loses, will it be sufficient to change this system? And a lot of the reason politicians are behaving the way they're behaving is because the incentives of the system are, and of our media culture, and particularly our social media culture, are all driving lawmakers, driving the conversation towards these more disastrous outcomes.
Yeah, and a great transition. We should definitely talk about social media, because that has had an outsized impact on the presidency and the way we pick presidents and the way we have conversations. I've often said that Twitter is a festering cesspool of hatred and bile. And that it does no good for anybody. It coarsens everyone. I wake up in the morning and say, I'm not going to give in today. I will not give in today. And yet I am seduced by the dark side by lunchtime almost every day with this. But it really does have an impact, not only in the way we talk about the presidency, but also depriving us of the one thing that I think we need most of all, which is time to sit back and think and not be interrupted with someone calling you names and someone calling you an idiot and someone saying you're a terrible journalist and all this other stuff that you see on there. Time to think about some of these things that we've been talking about. We don't get that on Twitter because it's a constant stream of things, and you have 2 seconds to react and all of that.
Yes, I mean it's Twitter and it's Facebook as well. And what draws even skeptical people like yourself and like me back to Twitter is that every once in a while in the floating pool of muck is some really brilliant view of the world, or some beautiful piece of music, or some video that is affirming, or a well-argued point made in 240 characters, which is the best possible writers can convey a lot in a short amount of space, and occasionally you come across that in Twitter. And so the problem is it's not purely awful. It's got like 3% of good, and that 3% is very alluring. So yeah, I mean, there's often, and this is true both as a kind of personal hygiene matter in terms of wasting time on social media, which shreds your attention and coarsens us all. But there's also a way in which those of us who cover politics, misunderstand the conversation that's happening on Twitter and mistake it for what's happening in the country. And so, it's like trying to cover the temperance movement by only doing your reporting in a bar. You're really missing the rest of the story. And in this case, the rest of the country is not represented by the political obsessives on Twitter, or even the people who are constantly chatting on Twitter. Most of the country is off having their lives. Now, that isn't to say that the opinions of the obsessives on Twitter are meaningless. They're quite important, but they shouldn't be given excessive meaning, or they should be given meaning within their context, which is, political strategists or political obsessives or political hobbyists. And that's great. They think what they think, and they have a certain outsized influence. 100 political hobbyists do have more of an influence on the political process than 100 people who follow politics casually. But sometimes we cover the hobbyists and the obsessives as if they're the whole show, and get caught up in the nature of their debates. And that's not healthy, but either for us individual as journalists, but also it's not healthy if we're trying to give an accurate picture of what's happening in the country.
Yeah, and it also, as you say, the famous quote, "A lie gets halfway around the world before truth gets its boots on." Social media can amplify things that are simply just not true about a candidate, about a candidate's family, things like that. And those things, once they take root, is more difficult to argue against them. I think some of the research you showed in the book said that you're exposed to something that is not true. It becomes harder to convince a person who's been exposed to that what they have read is not true. It's sort of baked into their idea of what's going on, which is not good. And this is again a social media contribution to our dialogue.
Right. It's once something takes root in your brain that you weren't immediately skeptical of. If you hear something and you're skeptical and then something disproves it, then it's a little easier to knock it out because you were predisposed to thinking it was untrue. On the other hand, you either believe that, the alternative ways of responding is you hear something first, you take ownership of it, and it becomes essentially a part of your identity. And then when you hear contradictory information, it's not just contradicting an abstract piece of news, but it's now contradicting something that has burrowed into your sense of your identity. And so it can be destabilizing. It can be, it can give you the feeling of a lack of control, in the same way that good, accurate information can give you the feeling of control. And that's where it gets quite dangerous. Or an interim result is that you hear the contradiction or the fact check or whatever it is, and you think, okay, well, maybe it's wrong, but there must have been some truth to it. So you kind of take a halfway position. Even if the thing is absolutely, totally 100% wrong, there's a kind of residue that's left. Particularly, obviously, if we're of a mind to believe the first thing we heard anyway, and it's more comforting to believe it than to believe something that's wrong.
Someone once told me they would not let someone put something in the newspaper if it were untrue. And in that moment, as a journalist, my heart leapt, but as a citizen, my heart broke simultaneously. I don't know. The Germans probably have a word for exactly that feeling, but I don't know what it is. Given these forces, the excessive partisanship, the imperfect way in which we're picking presidential candidates, do you think that there is honestly ever a chance that we can get back to an age where the people who get elected put the campaigning aside once they get there and say, now it is time for the governing? We said what we said on the campaign. I called you this name, you called me that name, and we fought it out. but we've both been sent here by the people to do the people's business. So now we're going to put that aside and cooperate, even as these partisans on Twitter are going to call us rhinos and squishes and compromisers and weak tea. We're still going to get something done for the American people. Is that possible, or am I just reminiscing about a halcyon age that never was?
Well, we won't know until we try. I mean, all of the possible dangers of going that way, you've outlined pretty well. And the problem with the escalating nature of our politics is that for a new president to arrive, the first thing that happens is their political base thinks that they were the ones who did it. So they're expecting some kind of big payback. And that's immediately a problem. Secondly, the political base is the ones most likely to be the most outraged about the previous offenses of the previous administration. So therefore, if they see this person they feel owes them their job, going over and working with the other side of the aisle, the people they think are responsible for the greatest outrages, it's a kind of it's a pretty heavy slap in the face. And so it takes a lot of intestinal fortitude for a president to do that. Donald Trump was in a great position to do that, because often what keeps a president from doing that is not only their sense of self-preservation, but also they kind of agree with their base a little bit because they have longstanding principles that are built through party being in the party, and therefore they kind of can see where that side of the group is coming from. Donald Trump had no affection or allegiance to the Republican Party. He'd switched parties multiple times in his life. He wasn't a lifelong Republican. So he could have done a lot of things that might have ticked people off, but he wouldn't have felt a real pull in his heart of hearts because he hasn't been a Republican for very long. He likes to mix things up. And so he could have done sort of what you're talking about if he wanted to. He chose not to. But it'll be, if Joe Biden is elected president, it'll be one of the really interesting challenges about what he does first and how much he's willing to disappoint his left flank. And the reason that's important, among other things, is if he does something that immediately energizes his most liberal supporters, that may be what he wants to do in his heart. But by definition, anything that the liberals are really going to love, the conservatives are really not going to love. So he would immediately start off his presidency with an antagonistic act. Now, some people would say, and Barack Obama might say, look, on the right, they're going to react antagonistically no matter what he does. So forget about trying to game it out. Just do what you're going to do, even if it's quite liberal or quite extreme, because they're going to react like it's extreme anyway. So you might as well might as well try and do the thing. Because if you try to do half of what we would like to do, they're going to react just as if we'd done the whole. So it'll be really interesting how Joe Biden evaluates what the real nature of politics in America is right now, after having run a campaign in which he's talking about going back to those halcyon days.
Yeah, and it's funny because after Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, the friendship between Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Antonin Scalia was extolled as this great example of people who disagreed and fought with each other all the time, but were still friends. The same thing with Joe Biden and John McCain. They didn't agree, but they were still friends. They came from an age where that was not considered a bad thing. Meanwhile, at the conclusion of the hearings for Amy Coney Barrett, Lindsey Graham praised Dianne Feinstein and gave her a hug. And both of them were immediately excoriated by the respective wings. Oh, Feinstein, how can she be friends with such a person? I knew this thing was all a sham. It was a put-up job. And Lindsey Graham, that guy, I can't believe he's said anything nice about someone who was the mayor of San Francisco. My God. And so the contrast between those two things, are we supposed to appreciate these cross-aisle partisanships, or are we supposed to be repelled by them? Just in a short period of time, gave you whiplash to watch.
Yes, I mean, the particular circumstances are rather acute, in part because Lindsey Graham is, in a close race in South Carolina, and
Yeah.
Democrats would like to take that seat, and they'd like to take the majority. So that might have been a special case where where just given how high the stakes are for Democrats, they wouldn't have minded kind of the perfunctory comments about cooperation from Dianne Feinstein, and then not the full-throated thing. So that might have been a slightly special case, but your larger point is, of course, right, which is any of what would have been pretty banal and perfunctory and pro forma expressions of institutional comedy, as they call it, not comedy, but comedy, are now seen as signs of awful capitulation or giving comfort to the enemy.
So interestingly enough, in order to get elected, a president must appeal to the base, appeal to members of his or her party in order to get the chance to be president. But after that, after election, in some cases may have to disappoint that very base if that person is to govern, as you say, in a durable way, to get Congress along and to, by regular order, pass laws and sign laws and enforce laws that are going to be necessarily the result of a compromise.
Yes, I mean, and this is, I mean, we haven't really, we've seen some of it. I mean, you basically, a president's going to have to disappoint their supporters right away. Bill Clinton chose not to do that with gays in the military, and it bollocksed up the beginning of his administration. Because every decision a president makes at the beginning of this administration shapes the field on which those future decisions are going to be made. So if Donald Trump had started off by trying to put together a bipartisan infrastructure deal with Democrats, he might have been able to succeed. And that would have then maybe changed the environment for anything he wanted to do on healthcare. Now, Reince Priebus, who's the chief of staff at the time for Donald Trump, would say, you're crazy. First of all, Democrats wouldn't have ultimately worked with Donald Trump on an infrastructure bill because they had women marching across the cities of all of America talking about how awful Donald Trump was. And Chuck Schumer was not in the Senate going to work with Donald Trump and anger that very important part of his constituency. And then secondly, he would say they might have been able to agree, President Trump and the Democrats in Senate, enough of them, to pass some kind of bill on taxes or immigration, but there would be no buildup of goodwill. So when they got to talking about healthcare, those arrangements that might have held for the production of an initial piece of legislation, whether it was infrastructure or tax cuts or whatever, would have disappeared instantaneously. So there's no such thing where you build up goodwill. You're basically always starting from the same partisan place. So we don't know because it wasn't tried. And Joe Biden is promising to try. And so we'll see if he's elected, if that can be done.
Yeah, definitely. He is definitely campaigning in the mode of, saying, look, I will work as hard for the people who voted for me as those who did not vote for me. And there's nothing we can't do if we don't do it together. As you can see, his advertising is very effective because it's burrowed into my consciousness and I can repeat those things on command. So we're almost out of time, but I did want to ask this last question, not only for myself, but for all of the journalists in the audience to watch this. Having gone through this experience of writing this book and reevaluating how we go about our jobs when it comes to covering this most important and hardest job in the world, what advice would you give to journalists about changing the way that we go about this, asking the right questions so as to produce information that people may not know they need, but nonetheless desperately need if they're going to make the right choice and maybe a more intelligent process than that we've had up till now?
Well, I'll throw a few out in no particular order. The one most important thing, actually, having now just said no particular order, and now I'm saying it's the most important, but I think that's actually true, is to always ask why. So a lot of times in political coverage in particular, there will be, lots of coverage about whatever the thing of the moment is. And no one ever explains why the thing of the moment is important. They just say everybody's all concerned about this, and social media makes it worse because now sometimes people are uh, saying when they write a story or do a news report on the air, proof of why it's worth talking about is the fact that it caused an uproar on Twitter or is getting a lot of notice on social media. That's not a sufficient reason to do a story. So always think about, why is this important? If nothing else, it'll give lift to your story that may be about something that seems small, but that has a larger truth at the center of it. And that's the why this is important. So don't just tell them what happened, but tell them why it happened and why that's important. So that's a really big one. The other is to study history, to give us some sense of how things were done before, where some of these standards came from, why the standards of behavior existed before, because there's a lot of norms and standards that are being thrown away, some of which might be a good reason that they're being thrown away. Others were vital to be able to get things done in previous administrations or in previous political arrangements. I think to think in a non-binary way about all those presidential attributes at the end of the book that I list, and to think about the continuum of presidential behavior and just public behavior of mayors and governors. So don't give in to the partisans who want to write off a politician because they demonstrate any part of a certain political attribute or don't demonstrate a part of that attribute. Think instead about how important it is that they demonstrate this attribute or don't along a continuum. And then I think finally is to keep in mind the job that the person running for office actually has to do and whether they have any of the skills for it. It seems like a very simple thing. That would be the way we would hire anyone, even to work at the makeup counter at Macy's. And yet we allow candidates to describe the requirements for the job. And then, don't you know, turns out they have all the requirements that they just said the job is necessary for defining. Well, that's not the way it works. You don't get to go and be, the columnist for the New York Times by saying, look, what you really need, what is crucial to have the best columnist in America is to have someone in their early 50s with blonde hair who is currently talking to you right now. That's just not an objective standard for excellence. And we wouldn't allow that in any other profession. So why in God's name do we allow it in politics or most of all in the presidency? So to keep the job in mind for which the people are running for office. And that's both important to measure those people against a fixed standard, but then also to measure what they're saying against the job, because a lot of times politicians say stuff that has nothing to do with the price of tea in China, as they used to say when I was growing up. It has nothing to do with what the job's going to be about or what's important to address in the job. And kind of always coming back to that main point keeps the main thing, which is ever harder in these days of distraction.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, John, thank you so much. The book is The Hardest Job in the World, The American Presidency. The author is John Dickerson. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. We definitely appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Steve. It's good to be back with you again. And I really enjoyed myself. So thank you.
Absolutely.